German Shepherd kept digging like mad. What came out of the ground shocked the whole town. Some stories are not just told, they are felt. A dog's loyalty, a human's courage, and a bond that refuses to break. What you're about to hear will stay in your heart long after it ends. Tell us, do you believe animals sense what humans cannot? If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It was close to midnight when the little town lay wrapped in silence. The streets were empty, porches dark, and windows shut tight against the chill of the night air. Normally, this was the hour when even the last whispers of life faded, leaving only the sound of crickets and the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees. But on this night, peace was broken by a sound that would not stop, the furious digging of a German shepherd. His paws tore into the earth with relentless force, sending dirt flying in every direction. The sound of nails scraping against the soil carried across the quiet yards, sharp and unsettling. His breaths came in short bursts, rough and determined, as though something beneath the ground was calling to him, pulling him deeper and deeper into his frenzy. To anyone watching, it looked as if the dog was chasing ghosts buried long ago. One by one, the lights in nearby houses flickered on. Curtains shifted, doors opened, and sleepy faces peered out into the night. At first, some chuckled. "That dog's gone mad," one man muttered from his porch. Another shook his head, pulling his coat tighter. "It's just a hole he's after. Probably a rabbit or a mole," he said, trying to sound certain but failing. Yet the German shepherd didn't behave like a dog chasing prey. His growls were low and urgent, his eyes fixed on the patch of ground as if he alone could see something hidden far beneath. Every muscle in his body trembled with the effort, but he refused to stop. His fur bristled, his tail stiff, and his claws kept striking the earth faster, harder, until the dirt beneath his paws looked like it had been clawed open by desperation itself. By now, more people had gathered along the edge of the street. Neighbors whispered to one another, some nervous, some annoyed. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, their eyes wide in fear. A woman crossed herself, whispering, "Dogs don't act like this for no reason." An old man shook his head, muttering, "They sense things we cannot." The words spread like wildfire among the crowd, feeding the unease that gripped every heart. Still, no one dared approach too close. The shepherd's bark tore through the night, sharp, commanding, and impossible to ignore. It was not the playful bark of a pet nor the warning bark of a guard dog. It was something else entirely. Something deeper, raw, filled with urgency, as if he was shouting at the world to pay attention. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The crowd grew restless. "Get him to stop," one man called. "He'll wake the whole town." But another voice quickly answered, "Can't you see? He knows something we don't." Murmurs rippled through the group, blending fear with curiosity. What could possibly be buried beneath that spot? Why would a dog risk exhausting himself, digging like mad, if it wasn't something more than earth and stones? The shepherd's paws struck deeper still, his body trembling with effort. His howls rose higher, no longer just the sound of an animal but something that pierced into human hearts, a cry that carried both desperation and warning. People shifted uneasily, their breaths held, waiting for something they could not name. And then, as the wind howled and the moon slipped behind a thick cloud, silence fell for the briefest moment. The shepherd stopped, his body stiff, his head lowered close to the ground. The crowd leaned in, holding their breath. No one knew what was hidden below, but when it finally surfaced, it would leave the town in absolute shock. The town was the kind of place most people only passed through on their way to somewhere bigger. A single main street cut through its heart, lined with weathered brick buildings, a diner that smelled of coffee and bacon, a barbershop where old men sat swapping stories, and a general store that sold everything from nails to notebooks. Life here moved slowly, like the steady ticking of the clock inside the post office. People valued routine, tradition, and the comfort of knowing that tomorrow would look almost exactly like today. Every morning, church bells rang out across the rooftops, calling families to breakfast tables and school buses. Farmers rose before the sun, their fields stretching wide beyond the town's edges. In the afternoons, children played in yards while their parents sat on porches, gossiping quietly about who bought a new truck or whose roses bloomed the brightest. Life in this town had a rhythm, and most folks saw no reason to disturb it. But beneath that calm surface, the town held secrets, forgotten corners, abandoned places that no one cared to visit. They were woven into the stories parents told their children, warnings mixed with folklore. Every town has its ghosts, and this one was no different. At the far edge of town lay an empty lot, just a patch of uneven earth bordered by tall weeds and a leaning wooden fence. Nothing grew there, not really. No one built there either, though no one could quite remember why. It was just one of those places people overlooked, as if ignoring it made it less real. Children sometimes cut across it as a shortcut, daring one another to run through at night, but most avoided it without even realizing they were doing so. Older folks, though, remembered. They would glance toward the lot and shake their heads, muttering about things best left buried. Their words slipped into hushed tones, never loud enough to be taken as fact, but never quiet enough to be forgotten. Some spoke of strange noises in the night, a sound like scratching or crying that drifted on the wind. Others swore they'd seen flickers of light where no lantern should have been. But as the years passed, the whispers faded, and the lot became nothing more than an empty stretch of ground people pretended was ordinary. It was easier that way. Easier to let silence fill the gaps where truth should be. Easier to dismiss the stories as old folks' ramblings, the kind that grew taller with each retelling. After all, the town prided itself on being normal, safe, predictable. Anything that hinted otherwise was quickly smoothed over, tucked away behind closed doors and polite smiles. And so the lot remained untouched. Seasons came and went, snow blanketed it in winter, wildflowers pushed through in spring, but no one lingered there. The wooden fence leaned a little further each year, its posts rotting at the base. Weeds grew tall enough to hide small animals, and the ground itself seemed uneven, as though something beneath had shifted long ago. Still, when people passed by, they quickened their steps without meaning to. Parents warned children not to play there, offering no reason beyond, "It's not safe." Pets tugged at their leashes, eager to avoid it. Even birds seemed to fly around instead of over. The lot carried an unease that words couldn't capture, the kind that settled in the stomach and stayed there. It was in this forgotten place that the German shepherd dug with madness in his eyes. The spot most people ignored, the ground no one dared disturb, had suddenly become the center of the town's unease. For years, it had been left alone, its silence unbroken. But now, claw by claw, bark by bark, the dog was peeling away the peace the town had built around it. The whispers returned with each scrape of his paws. Folks began to remember the old stories their grandparents told them, about things hidden underground, about secrets best left untouched. They tried to laugh it off, tried to say it was nothing, but the laughter didn't reach their eyes. Deep down, everyone knew. There had always been something about that lot. Something strange. Something waiting. And now, with every shovelful of earth the dog sent flying, it felt as though whatever was buried there was clawing its way back into the town's memory. Rocky was not just any dog. He was a German shepherd with a proud stance, sharp amber eyes, and a coat that glistened like burnished bronze in the sunlight. To his owner, Thomas, Rocky was more than a pet. He was family. Loyal to the bone, alert to the smallest sound, and protective of everyone in the household, Rocky had always been the kind of dog that made people stop and admire him. He followed Thomas everywhere, whether to the fields, the market, or just down the street, and his steady presence gave the family comfort. But lately, something had changed. It began quietly, almost unnoticed. One afternoon, as Thomas walked Rocky past the empty lot, the shepherd froze. His ears perked, nose twitching, and he tugged hard at the leash. Thomas frowned, thinking maybe a rabbit had burrowed in the weeds or some other small creature had made its home there. But when Rocky lowered his head and began sniffing furiously at the same patch of ground, Thomas had to drag him away. At first, he laughed it off. Dogs had instincts. They caught scents people couldn't, and sometimes they made a fuss over nothing. But the next day, Rocky did the same thing. And the day after that. Every time they passed the lot, Rocky pulled to the same spot, muscles tense, tail stiff, nostrils flaring as if the earth itself carried a message only he could understand. Soon it wasn't just during walks. Rocky began slipping away from the yard, running back to the lot, and digging with desperate claws. His powerful paws tore at the soil until his nails split, dirt clinging to his fur, his chest heaving with effort. Thomas would find him there, barking and growling, his eyes wild, refusing to stop even when called. It was as if something beneath the ground had consumed him. Neighbors started to notice. From their porches, they saw the once calm shepherd grow restless and unhinged. He refused meals, ignoring even his favorite treats. His ribs began to show, not from neglect but from obsession. At night, his barks echoed through the quiet streets, loud enough to wake the lightest sleepers. Families complained, children cried, and the whole town whispered. "What's gotten into that dog?" one man muttered at the diner. "Maybe he's sick," another suggested. But then came the words that made everyone shift uneasily in their seats. "Dogs sense things we cannot." It wasn't just a saying here. It was a belief passed down through generations. People trusted animals more than they trusted their own instincts. If a dog barked at a stranger, folks grew wary. If a dog refused to enter a home, families took it as a warning. And Rocky, well, Rocky was no ordinary dog. He was known for his sharpness, his intelligence. If he was acting this way, it meant something. Children whispered stories as they passed the lot. Some claimed Rocky was digging for treasure. Others said he was trying to free the ghost of someone buried long ago. One little boy swore he saw shadows moving where Rocky scratched, though no one believed him. The adults dismissed the tales as childish fancy, but when they walked by, even they felt uneasy. Thomas, meanwhile, grew more worried with each passing day. He tried everything, feeding Rocky away from the lot, chaining him in the yard, even keeping him indoors. But nothing worked. The moment Rocky was free, he bolted back, driven by an invisible force. His growls grew deeper, his eyes wilder, as though he were fighting something no one else could see. At night, when the moon hung low and the town slept, Rocky's howls tore through the darkness. They were not the howls of loneliness or boredom. They were cries filled with warning, with urgency, as if he were calling out to someone, anyone, to listen. People shook their heads and muttered, "That dog has gone mad." But beneath their words lay fear. Because deep down, they knew madness wasn't the answer. Something was wrong with that patch of earth. Something was hidden there. And Rocky, with every scrape of his paws and every desperate bark, was trying to tell them. And though they tried to ignore it, tried to convince themselves it was nothing more than a dog's obsession, the truth lingered heavy in the air. Dogs never lie about danger. Rocky knew. The only question was, would anyone listen before it was too late? One bright afternoon, when the sun painted the sidewalks in golden light and the cicadas hummed lazily in the trees, Rocky was once again at the empty lot. His paws tore at the ground in frantic bursts, his body trembling with exhaustion but refusing to stop. Dirt clung to his fur, his nails were worn and cracked, and yet his eyes burned with determination. From across the street, a little girl stopped and watched. She couldn't have been older than 3. Her blue dress swayed around her knees as she held tightly to her mother's hand. Wide-eyed and curious, she tilted her head at the sight of the frantic German shepherd. "Mommy," she asked softly, tugging at her mother's sleeve, "why is the doggy digging so hard? What is he trying to find?" Her voice was light and innocent, carrying no judgment, only pure curiosity. But to the grown-ups standing nearby, her words hit like a chill. They exchanged nervous glances, their faces stiff. No one had an answer. The mother tried to shush her, murmuring, "Don't worry about it, sweetheart. He's just being silly." But the child's wide eyes never left Rocky. His growls rumbled in his chest, deep and insistent, as if he were answering her question with sounds only he understood. Then, as Rocky paused to catch his breath, the little girl whispered again, this time louder. "Who's hiding there?" The words cut through the air like a blade. The neighbors, gathered at their porches and fences, shifted uneasily. One man cleared his throat, muttering, "Children say the strangest things." A woman beside him folded her arms tightly, her eyes fixed on the patch of earth. Strange things indeed. The girl pulled away from her mother's grip and walked a few steps closer, her tiny shoes crunching on gravel. In her hand, she clutched a small toy, a wooden block with faded paint, the kind children love to carry everywhere. Kneeling at the edge of the lot, she placed it carefully on the dirt, right where Rocky dug, as though offering her help. "There," she said in a sweet, steady voice. "Maybe this will help him find it." Gasps rose from the adults nearby, though no one could explain why. Perhaps it was the sight of such innocence laid against Rocky's desperate fury, or perhaps it was because her words sounded less like play and more like truth. Rocky stopped for just a moment. He sniffed at the toy, his chest heaving, then let out a soft whine. It was a different sound from the barks and growls that had filled the town for nights. This was gentler, almost mournful, as though the child's innocence had reached some part of him the adults could not. The little girl smiled. "See, Mommy? He's not bad. He's just trying to tell us something." Her mother hurried forward, scooping her up quickly and pulling her back toward the sidewalk. "Don't get close to him," she scolded, her voice shaking more from fear than anger. She carried the child away, but the girl's curious eyes remained locked on Rocky until the corner of the street swallowed her from view. The crowd lingered, whispers swirling. "Kids always notice things we ignore," someone muttered. Another added, "Maybe she's right. Maybe he is trying to tell us something." But then came the uneasy silence, the kind that falls when people are too afraid to finish their thoughts. Rocky returned to his digging, his claws ripping at the soil with renewed fury, as if fueled by the girl's words. Each strike of his paw sounded louder now, echoing against the quiet fear that had gripped the crowd. The earth seemed heavier, darker, as though it was holding on to secrets that refused to stay buried. And though the adults tried to laugh it off, their smiles were weak, their voices strained. Deep down, they couldn't forget the way the child had asked her question, as if she already knew the answer. What is he trying to find? Who's hiding there? The innocence of her words lingered long after she had gone, heavier than any whisper or rumor. For while the grown-ups looked away, trying to dismiss the unease, everyone in their hearts felt the same truth. The dog was not digging for nothing. Something, or someone, was waiting beneath that ground. The storm rolled in just after sunset. Thick, heavy clouds gathered above the small town, swallowing the last streaks of daylight until the sky turned a bruised shade of gray. The first drops of rain fell softly at first, pattering against tin roofs and rattling on porch steps, but soon the heavens opened in full force. Sheets of rain poured down, drenching the earth, while thunder cracked so loud it shook windows in their frames. Most families stayed indoors that night, shutters closed, lamps glowing warmly behind glass. But outside, in the empty lot at the edge of town, Rocky was far from safe or still. His paws tore into the earth as though the storm itself had commanded him. Mud clung to his fur, rain plastered his ears flat against his head, but he didn't slow down. With each flash of lightning, his body appeared like a dark silhouette against the soaked ground, frantic, determined, unstoppable. He barked and howled into the night, his cries sharp enough to cut through the roar of thunder. His claws raked the soil, sending clumps of mud flying into the air, splattering across the wooden fence and mixing with the rain. He was drenched, trembling from the cold, but nothing could pull him away from that patch of ground. From their windows, villagers began to notice. Curtains twitched, doors opened, and lanterns flickered to life despite the storm. People muttered, shaking their heads. "That dog's gone mad," one man said, pulling his coat around his shoulders as he stepped onto his porch. "He'll dig himself straight to the center of the earth." Others weren't so quick to dismiss it. They stood frozen on their porches, their eyes fixed on Rocky as his howls rose higher. Some crossed themselves, whispering prayers under their breath. Mothers pulled children closer, warning them not to stare. There was something about the way Rocky moved, something about the desperation in his cries, that unsettled even the bravest hearts. Lightning split the sky again, lighting up the lot as though it were daytime for a brief second. In that flash, everyone could see the wild fury in Rocky's eyes. The mud streaked across his legs, the ground torn into deep grooves by his relentless claws. His body shook, but he pressed forward, digging faster, harder, as if time itself were running out. And then it happened. Between the crashes of thunder and the steady drum of rain, another sound slipped through the night. At first, it was faint, barely more than a murmur. Some thought it was just the storm, a trick of the wind. But then it came again, clearer, sharper. A muffled sound, rising from beneath the very ground Rocky was clawing at. The villagers stiffened. Their breath caught in their throats as they strained to hear. It was impossible, unthinkable, but it was there. Sound like crying. Weak, fragile, desperate. Gasps spread through the crowd that had gathered at the edge of the lot. "Did you hear that?" a woman whispered, clutching her husband's arm. He nodded slowly, his face pale, his eyes wide. Another man shook his head, muttering, "No, no, it can't be." But the look on his face betrayed the disbelief he tried to force. Rocky howled louder, his voice piercing the storm, echoing across the town. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was a call, a demand. His whole body shook with urgency, his paws tearing deeper into the mud as though he was racing against death itself. The sound came again, faint, muffled, but unmistakable. A small voice, choked and weak, rising from beneath the ground. This time, no one could deny it. People froze where they stood, fear prickling down their spines. Mothers clutched their children tighter, men exchanged uneasy glances, and whispers spread like wildfire. "There's something down there. Dear God, He's been right all along." The storm raged on, lightning flashing and thunder booming, but all eyes remained fixed on the frantic shepherd. His body was a blur of motion, mud flying in every direction, his howls raw and haunting. The villagers could no longer look at him as a mad dog. No, he was a messenger, a protector, an alarm sounding in the night. And though the rain kept falling, though the thunder kept shaking the earth, it was the muffled cries from below that truly chilled the town to its bones. Something, or someone, was trapped beneath that soil. By the following morning, the storm had passed, but the memory of the night before lingered heavy in the town. Whispers buzzed through the diner, the church steps, and the marketplace. Everyone had heard Rocky's cries. Everyone had felt the unease. And though many tried to dismiss it as nothing more than the wind playing tricks, Deep down they knew better. Thomas, Rocky's owner, could no longer bear the weight of it. He had watched his dog claw at the earth with a desperation that bordered on madness. He had heard those faint cries, just as the rest of the town had. The thought haunted him, what if there truly was something beneath that ground? Something alive. Something waiting. That afternoon, with a trembling hand, Thomas picked up the phone and called the sheriff's office. His voice cracked as he explained, stumbling over his words, half afraid they would laugh at him. To his surprise, the dispatcher didn't mock him. She simply said they would send someone out to take a look. By early evening, 2 patrol cars rolled up to the lot, their headlights cutting through the lengthening shadows. A few officers stepped out, adjusting their belts, their flashlights sweeping casually across the ground. At first, their voices were light, their chuckles carrying the confidence of men who thought they were answering nothing more than a nervous citizen's call. "So this is it?" one deputy said, shining his beam over the muddy patch. "The famous digging dog." Another laughed, shaking his head. "Looks like he's trying to dig himself to China." But their smiles faded quickly when they saw Rocky. The shepherd stood at the torn-up ground, his paws filthy, his chest still heaving as though he'd never stopped digging. His eyes glowed with fierce determination, and the low growl rumbling from his throat was steady, unbroken. He stood guard over the earth as if it were sacred, as if moving him even an inch would bring disaster. One officer stepped closer, but Rocky snapped his jaws, barking with such force that the man stumbled back. His flashlight beam wavered, bouncing across the soil before settling on the grooves Rocky had carved deep into the mud. The ground was torn wide open in places, claw marks clear and sharp, as though a beast had been fighting to get something out, or to keep something in. The sheriff himself arrived moments later, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel. He was a man known for his calm demeanor, rarely rattled, but as he approached the dog, his brow furrowed. "That's no ordinary behavior," he muttered. Thomas hurried forward, clutching Rocky's leash but barely able to restrain him. "Sheriff, you've got to believe me," he said, his voice strained. "He's been at it for days. Last night we all heard something. There's something down there." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. One tried to laugh it off, muttering, "Maybe just the storm." But the others didn't echo him this time. The silence hung too heavy, the memory of those faint cries too fresh. Rocky barked again, his body pressed low, his tail stiff as a rod. His paws scraped at the mud, his eyes locked on the ground as though daring anyone to ignore him. The officers found themselves shifting uncomfortably, their flashlights moving in restless circles, searching for something they couldn't quite name. The sheriff knelt down near the edge of the disturbed earth, running his gloved hand across the grooves in the soil. His beam caught on something unusual. The ground looked pressed from below, as though something had once pushed upward, struggling against the weight above it. He stood slowly, his jaw tightening. "This isn't nothing," he said quietly. "This isn't just a dog losing his mind." A ripple of unease moved through the small crowd that had gathered behind the police cars. Villagers had followed the flashing lights, drawn by curiosity and fear. They stood in tight clusters, whispering, their eyes wide as they watched the shepherd guard the earth with unwavering resolve. Mothers clutched their children's hands. Old men shook their heads, murmuring the same line over and over again, "Dogs sense things we cannot." The sheriff straightened, his expression dark. "Get the lights," he ordered his men. "We're not leaving this spot until we know what's going on." Flashlights flickered brighter, beams cutting through the night as the air grew thick with anticipation. The laughter that had marked the officers' arrival was gone. In its place was tension, a weight that pressed against every chest. Even the storm clouds, though broken apart, seemed to linger above the lot, as if the sky itself refused to let the night settle into peace. Rocky barked once more, his voice sharp and commanding. Then he fell into silence, his body still, his eyes locked on the ground. It was as if he knew his job was done, as if the humans had finally begun to listen. For the first time, the officers no longer looked at Rocky as a nuisance or a distraction. They looked at him as a guide. And in that moment, everyone, police, townsfolk, and even Thomas himself, knew with chilling certainty that something alive was trapped beneath their feet. The night had grown heavy with silence after the storm had passed, but the ground still glistened with rain. Flashlights cut through the darkness as the police and a few rescuers gathered around the spot where Rocky had been digging like a creature possessed. His paws were muddy, his fur damp, but his eyes burned with a wild urgency that made everyone uneasy. He wasn't just scratching dirt anymore. He was fighting against something unseen, as though every scoop of earth mattered more than life itself. His owner stood nearby, torn between fear and awe, realizing that whatever was beneath the ground was pulling the dog into a battle that no human could fully understand. The sheriff muttered under his breath as he handed out shovels. "We might as well dig. If nothing else, maybe it'll calm him down." But the laughter that had colored their voices earlier was gone now. Every man felt the weight of the moment as their boots pressed into the softened earth. Rocky paced frantically around them, barking whenever their arms slowed, nudging their hands with his snout as if begging them not to stop. His cries carried across the darkened lot, echoing against the empty houses, pulling neighbors from their windows. Before long, a small crowd had gathered, whispering to one another, their faces pale in the dim light. The first few inches of soil gave easily, damp and soft from the rain. But as the rescuers dug deeper, the earth grew colder, heavier. The air itself seemed to change, carrying with it a damp chill that raised goosebumps on their arms. One of the officers paused, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. "You feel that?" he asked. Nobody answered, but the unease in their silence spoke volumes. They all felt it, that uncanny sensation that they weren't just disturbing dirt, but uncovering something that had been hidden, something that did not want to stay buried. A metallic scrape rang out as one of the shovels hit something solid. The sound sent a jolt through the men's arms and through the crowd's hearts. Every head turned toward the hole, and Rocky's barking reached a fever pitch. He leapt forward, his paws clawing at the edge, throwing dirt behind him with desperate strength. The rescuer crouched down, brushing away the soil with his gloved hands. "Wood," he whispered, his voice trembling. The beam of a flashlight revealed rough planks pressed tightly together, damp and scarred with long, jagged marks. Scratch marks? Human or animal, it didn't matter. They told a story of struggle, of something, or someone, trapped beneath, clawing for freedom. Gasps rose from the gathered townsfolk, mothers clutching their children closer, old men shaking their heads as if refusing to believe. "Lord have mercy," someone muttered, crossing themselves. The sheriff barked an order, his voice sharper now. "Keep going. Careful, but don't stop." Shovels dug faster, soil flying as adrenaline replaced doubt. Every scrape of wood became clearer, every new mark uncovered sending chills down their spines. The cold air rising from the hole grew stronger, carrying with it a faint, sour smell that made stomachs turn. Still, Rocky urged them on, his barks now broken by whines, his body trembling with urgency. Then, in the fragile silence between two thunderclaps, it happened. A sound. Not the scrape of metal on wood, not the thud of shovels. Softer, fragile, a muffled thump. Then another. The rescuers froze, exchanging wide-eyed looks, their breath caught in their throats. "Did you hear that?" one whispered. Another leaned closer to the opening, his ear near the damp wood. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of rain dripping from the trees. And then it came again, faint, hollow, like knuckles tapping weakly against the inside of the boards. The crowd erupted in cries of disbelief. Women covered their mouths. Men shouted for the rescuers to hurry. The sheriff's voice cut through the chaos, firm but quivering. "There's someone in there. Move faster." The men dug with renewed fury, pulling away clumps of earth with bare hands when shovels proved too slow. Dirt caked their nails, streaked their cheeks, but they didn't stop. Rocky was nearly frantic, his paws bleeding from the effort, his howls cutting through the night like a blade. His owner tried to pull him back, but the dog resisted, eyes never leaving the boards below, as if his soul was tethered to whatever or whoever was inside. The boards came into clearer view now, their surfaces covered in scratches that spoke of long, desperate hours. Deep grooves where fingernails had torn away, shallow scuffs where weaker hands had tried again and again. The sight made even hardened officers swallow hard. "My God," one whispered, voice breaking. "There's life down there." The sheriff nodded grimly, his jaw set tight. "And we're going to get them out." Lanterns and flashlights circled the hole, beams cutting through the dirt-streaked air. The rescuers dropped to their knees, shovels cast aside, and began tearing at the last layers of soil with bare, blistered hands. The crowd above shouted encouragement, some praying aloud, others weeping openly. The night air vibrated with tension, hope and dread woven together in a tapestry no one would forget. Every second felt stretched, suspended between despair and salvation. Finally, as the last handfuls of dirt were brushed aside, one of the men pressed his ear against the wood and called out, "There's breathing. I can hear it." The words rippled through the crowd like fire through dry grass. Hope surged, breaking the wall of fear. Rocky barked once, sharp and commanding, then sat at perfect attention, his chest heaving, eyes locked on the wooden planks. He had done his part. Now it was up to the humans to finish what he had started. The sheriff's hand trembled as he signaled the men. "Get this open. Now." Crowbars were fetched, metal biting into wood with groans that echoed like cries from the grave. Every creak made hearts hammer harder. The boards were thick, soaked from years underground, but determination fueled every swing. Rocky whimpered, a low, desperate sound, as though he feared they wouldn't be quick enough. Then, at last, a crack split through the night. A plank gave way, then another. Cold air rushed upward, damp and heavy, wrapping around them like the breath of a long-buried secret. And beneath it all, faint but unmistakable, came a sound that froze every soul present. A cough, fragile, but alive. The silence that followed was shattered by cries of relief, by sobs that shook shoulders, by prayers whispered into trembling hands. The sheriff dropped his crowbar, his eyes glistening. "There's someone down there," he said, though every heart already knew. And with Rocky's wild howls echoing like a victory song, the digging continued with a fury born of hope. They weren't just breaking soil anymore. They were breaking chains, tearing open the earth to pull life back from where it should never have been left. And as the last of the boards splintered beneath their tools, the crowd held its breath, knowing that whatever they found next would mark their town forever. The night air was thick with suspense as the last boards gave way under the rescuers' crowbars. Every crack, every groan of the splintering would send shivers up the townsfolk's spines. What had begun as a dog's strange obsession had turned into a desperate mission that held the entire town hostage. Mothers clutched their children, old men removed their hats in reverence, and whispers of prayer floated through the damp night. The crowd leaned closer, hearts pounding as the rescuers bent low, shining flashlights into the hole that had been unearthed. At first, nothing stirred but shadows. The beams cut across rough wooden edges and the eerie darkness inside a small wooden crate buried deep beneath the soil. The crate was tightly sealed, built with care, as though someone had gone to great lengths to hide whatever was inside. Cold, damp air rolled out from the cracks, making the rescuers shiver. For a breathless moment, the silence returned, so complete that even the night insects seemed to hold their voices. Only Rocky's low growl broke the stillness, his body tense, his eyes fixed firmly on the crate as though he had known all along. The sheriff knelt, his flashlight trembling in his grip. He drew in a sharp breath. It's a box, sealed tight. Someone buried this on purpose. His words sent a ripple through the crowd. People gasped, some covering their mouths with shaking hands. The thought of someone deliberately hiding life, or death, beneath their very feet chilled them all. The rescuers exchanged grim looks, then set to work. With crowbars and hammers, they began to pry at the edges, the sound of creaking nails and splintering wood echoing across the silent lot. Sweat dripped down their brows despite the cool air, their urgency fueled not only by duty but by dread. Finally, with one last heave, the lid split open. A beam of light fell inside. Gasps erupted immediately. At first, it seemed to be only movement, small and shivering. Then the rescuers saw it clearly, a weak puppy curled in the corner of the crate, its tiny chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Its fur was matted, its whimpers faint, yet it was alive. The crowd cried out in shock and relief all at once. A puppy, buried beneath the earth, still clinging to life. Hardened officers softened instantly, their eyes glistening as one of them reached in carefully, cradling the fragile creature in his arms. But before the relief could settle, another sound drifted from the shadows inside the crate. A faint rustle, softer than the puppy's whine, yet undeniably human. The flashlight beam shifted, and the world seemed to stop. There, beside the small dog, was a child, a little girl, her limbs thin as sticks, her skin pale and streaked with dirt. She was trembling violently, her eyes wide but glassy, lips quivering as she clung to the puppy with what little strength she had left. The rescuers froze, their tools slipping from their hands as reality sank in. This wasn't just an abandoned animal. This was a child, buried alive. A wave of shock rippled through the crowd. Gasps and cries broke the silence. Mothers sobbed openly, fathers shouted in disbelief. Even the toughest men in uniform felt tears sting their eyes as they stared down into the crate. "Dear God," whispered the sheriff, his voice breaking, there's a child down there." The words cut through the night like a blade, leaving the town in stunned silence. Some people fell to their knees right where they stood, praying desperately as tears streamed down their faces. Rocky's barking stopped suddenly. The dog, who had been fierce and frantic, now let out a low, trembling whine. He crept closer to the hole, ears pinned back, eyes locked on the small figure inside. His whines grew softer, mournful, almost human. It was as though he was saying, I knew she was here all along." His entire body trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of his discovery. The rescuers moved quickly now. One climbed down into the hole, his hands shaking as he reached toward the crate. The girl flinched at first, pulling the puppy closer, her small body recoiling like a frightened animal. Her lips parted, but no sound came out, only a broken breath, weak and raspy. The man softened his tone, speaking gently, almost like a father soothing his own child. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now. We've got you." His words seemed to reach her. Slowly, with great hesitation, she loosened her grip, allowing him to lift the puppy first. The little animal whimpered as it was handed up, wrapped instantly in a blanket by waiting arms. Then came the moment that broke every heart. The rescuer slid his arms under the frail child and lifted her carefully from the crate. She was feather-light, her body limp with exhaustion, her hair tangled and full of soil. As her face came into the light, dirt streaks across her cheeks. The crowd gasped collectively. Her eyes fluttered half open, glazed with weakness, yet still clinging stubbornly to life. The sight was too much. Hardened police officers turned away, wiping their eyes with the backs of their hands. Mothers clutched their own children closer, sobbing openly. Some whispered, "Thank you, Lord," through their tears, their voices shaking with gratitude and grief. The sheriff stepped back, his face pale and wet with tears he made no effort to hide. "A child," he whispered again, shaking his head in disbelief. "Buried in the ground, and this dog found her." He looked at Rocky, his voice trembling with awe. "He saved her." The crowd turned their eyes to the shepherd. The once misunderstood barks, the endless digging, the frantic howls at night, all of it made sense now. Rocky had never been mad. He had been the only one who heard, the only one who knew. As the rescuer climbed out of the hole carrying the girl, the townsfolk parted in silence, their lanterns and flashlights casting halos of trembling light. People reached out, brushing the child's hand gently as she passed, as if needing to confirm she was real, that she had survived the unthinkable. Her small chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, each one a fragile miracle. Rocky padded close, his nose brushing her dangling hand, and for the first time that night, his tail wagged faintly. It wasn't joy, it was relief. His mission was complete, but his duty was far from over. The moment hung heavy in the air, etched forever into the memory of everyone present. The weak puppy whined softly from its blanket, the child stirred faintly in the rescuer's arms, and Rocky stood guard, silent now, as though the world needed no more noise, only the sound of hope breathing again. That night, the entire town was changed. They had stared into the shadows of the earth and seen a miracle pulled from it. And at the heart of it all was a dog who refused to give up, a shepherd whose loyalty had dug through darkness to reveal life where no one thought it possible. The moment the crate opened and the weak figures inside were revealed, the quiet town transformed into a scene of raw urgency. The rescuers wasted no time. Voices rose, orders flew through the damp night, and the once skeptical officers now moved with hands shaking, their flashlights darting across the pit like frantic fireflies. Every second felt heavy, as though time itself was holding its breath. Rocky stood just at the edge, his body pressed low, eyes locked on the girl and the puppy as if making sure no harm would come their way. His chest rose and fell quickly, his breaths almost as desperate as the child's. One of the younger officers cradled the puppy first, wrapping it in a blanket someone from the crowd had rushed forward to offer. The little animal was trembling, its whimpers muffled against the fabric, but its small chest still moved. The crowd sighed in relief at the sight, but that relief was brief. Every eye was fixed not on the puppy, but on the limp form still being lifted from the crate. The little girl, her tiny hands curled stiffly around nothing, seemed almost too fragile to be real. Her thin frame looked as if the night breeze might carry her away. As the rescuer carried her up the ladder, the townsfolk instinctively drew closer, lanterns and flashlights held high. The lights trembled in their hands, throwing long, quivering shadows across the muddy ground. The girl's face, streaked with dirt, caught the light just enough for everyone to see her shallow breaths, the rise and fall of her chest so faint it seemed to flicker like a candle about to die out. Gasps broke through the crowd. A woman dropped to her knees, clasping her hands together, whispering prayers through tears. Others covered their mouths, their eyes glistening in the glow. Doctors and volunteers, already alerted by frantic phone calls, rushed in with medical bags. Oxygen tanks hissed softly as masks were pulled from them. One doctor, an older man whose hands had delivered countless babies in this very town, pressed his fingers gently against the child's neck, searching for a pulse. His expression told more than his words. "She's alive," he whispered, voice trembling with both shock and relief. The crowd broke into cries, some sobbing, others thanking God aloud, their voices rising in the cold night air. The rescuers quickly cleared space on the damp ground, spreading out blankets. The girl was laid down with care, her head cradled as if she were glass. Her breathing was faint, shallow gasps that made even the most hardened officers wipe at their eyes. Her lips quivered as though trying to form words, but only a thin rasp escaped. The puppy, placed gently beside her for comfort, pressed its nose against her arm, as if reminding her she was not alone in this fight. Rocky pushed closer, slipping past the officers who tried to hold him back. He lowered himself beside her, his nose brushing her tiny dirt-streaked hand. His whine was soft, tender, filled with a kind of mourning, yet also filled with determination. The doctors didn't push him away. They knew somehow that the dog was part of her will to live, that his presence might be more powerful than medicine. One of the doctors opened a bag and pulled out a stethoscope. He leaned low, listening, nodding quickly. "She's fighting," he said. "We need to keep her warm." Blankets piled onto her small frame, lantern light glowing softly against the layers. Her lashes fluttered, her chest rising unevenly, but still rising. Each breath was a fragile miracle that bound the crowd together in silence and awe. The sheriff stood at the edge, his hat pressed tightly to his chest, his voice low and broken. This child should be gone. Buried in the earth like that, no one should survive. But here she is, alive, because of him. He looked at Rocky, his eyes wet. That dog saved her life. The words echoed through the crowd. People nodded, some openly weeping, others whispering prayers of thanks. The air was heavy with grief, yet also with hope, a strange blend that only such moments could stir. Old neighbors who hadn't spoken in years held each other, strangers prayed together, and parents clutched their own children tighter, realizing just how fragile life could be. As the doctors worked, the girl stirred faintly. Her lips parted again, her voice barely a breath. No one could make out the words, but Rocky seemed to understand. His ears perked, and he pressed his head gently against her arm. A hush fell over the crowd. It felt like the dog and the girl were speaking in a language only they could understand. A language of survival, of instinct, of love that had fought through the soil to reach the light again. Paramedics arrived then, carrying stretchers and additional equipment. The child was carefully lifted, oxygen mask now fitted over her face, the blankets tucked securely around her. As they secured her on the stretcher, the puppy was placed beside her once more. The crowd made way, parting like a sea, lanterns and flashlights guiding the way as though leading a procession. Every face they passed was marked with awe, grief, and a new kind of reverence. Rocky followed closely, refusing to let her out of his sight. His paws sank into the mud, his fur wet from the rain, yet he pressed forward, determined to remain her shadow. The officers made no attempt to stop him now. They knew his loyalty was as much a part of the rescue as their tools and training had been. Some even reached down to pat his head as he passed, murmuring words of gratitude through their tears. As the ambulance doors opened, the little girl was lifted inside, the puppy placed carefully at her side. Rocky paused at the threshold, his body tense, his eyes fixed on her fragile figure. A paramedic looked at him, then at the sheriff, who nodded quietly. "Let him in. He's earned his place." And so Rocky jumped inside, curling up beside her stretcher, his head resting near her hand as the doors closed softly. The sirens wailed, cutting through the stillness of the town. The ambulance sped away, carrying the child, the puppy, and the dog who had refused to give up on them. Behind it, the townsfolk stood in silence, their lanterns still glowing, their hearts heavy yet full. They had just witnessed something they would tell their children and grandchildren for years, The night when a dog's howls tore through the ordinary silence of their small town and dragged a miracle back from the edge of death. No one would ever look at that empty lot the same way again. And no one would ever forget the shepherd who kept digging, and in doing so, saved a life. The ride to the hospital felt endless, though in truth it lasted only minutes. The siren screamed through the night, bouncing off empty streets and dark houses, as if carrying the town's prayers with it. Inside the ambulance, the little girl lay wrapped in blankets, her face pale beneath the glow of the oxygen mask. Beside her, the puppy whimpered softly, its frail body tucked close against her chest. But it was Rocky, pressed firmly against the stretcher, who brought the greatest comfort. His big brown eyes never left the child's face, and every so often he leaned forward to lick her small dirt-streaked hand, as though reminding her to keep holding on. Doctors and nurses rushed to the ambulance bay as the vehicle skidded to a halt. The back doors swung open, and a team of medics reached inside, carefully lifting the stretcher out. Their voices rose with urgent commands: oxygen levels, blood pressure, heart rate, all measured in seconds. Yet even as the professionals took over, Rocky refused to back away. He padded alongside the stretcher, his body tense with determination, his ears alert for the faintest sound from the girl. Inside the hospital, fluorescent lights replaced the dim glow of lanterns. The air was sharp with the smell of antiseptic, but it felt safer, warmer, filled with the promise of life. Nurses rolled the stretcher down the long corridor, pushing through swinging doors toward the emergency unit. The puppy was handed to a veterinary technician waiting nearby, who immediately wrapped it in fresh blankets and checked its shallow breathing. The small creature sneezed weakly, then nestled deeper into the folds of fabric. A ripple of relief passed through those watching. Rocky, however, did not shift his focus. He padded beside the wheels of the stretcher until security hesitated, blocking the entrance to the treatment room. For a moment, it seemed he would be forced to stay behind. But the doctor in charge, the same man who had declared, "She's fighting," at the scene, lifted his hand. "Let him in," he said firmly. "That dog is part of why she's here. Don't separate them now." And so Rocky was allowed inside, his tail low, his body moving with careful restraint, as if he understood the gravity of the place. The little girl was lifted onto a hospital bed, monitors attached to her tiny frame. Nurses slipped 4 lines into her arm, oxygen adjusted to her shallow breaths. Rocky sat at the foot of the bed, watching every movement with unwavering loyalty. Each time the girl stirred faintly or whimpered in her sleep, he rose, leaned forward, and nudged her hand with his nose. Once, her small fingers twitched in response, brushing his fur, and a nurse nearby whispered through tears, "She knows he's here." Hours passed. Outside, the townsfolk lingered in the waiting area, unwilling to leave until they heard news. Some prayed aloud, others held one another, their whispers circling back to the same truth: if not for Rocky, we never would have known. The sheriff finally spoke to a group of reporters who had arrived. His voice broke as he admitted, "We ignored that lot for years. We ignored the signs. But this dog, he never stopped. If not for him, we wouldn't have dug there. That little girl and that puppy would be gone tonight." His words spread quickly, becoming a chorus of gratitude that echoed throughout the hospital. By morning, the child's condition had stabilized. The doctors announced she was weak, malnourished, but alive, and with care, she would recover. The news brought a wave of relief so strong that even the most stoic officers wept openly. Parents hugged their children tighter, townsfolk embraced strangers, and everyone spoke of Rocky with reverence. When the little girl finally opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was Rocky, curled against her bed. His head rested on the mattress, his gaze soft and steady, his tail thumping gently when her lips formed the faintest smile. A nurse captured the moment in a photograph, the image of a loyal German shepherd watching over a fragile child who owed her life to him. That picture would later hang in the town hall, a reminder of the night loyalty became a miracle. The puppy, too, began to recover. Fed with warm milk, wrapped in blankets, and cared for gently, it gained strength each passing day. Nurses allowed it to visit the girl often, placing it beside her on the bed, where it curled against her small frame. Rocky watched over both, as though his duty was not just to rescue but to guard until healing was complete. Word of Rocky's heroism spread beyond the town. Newspapers carried the story, calling him a guardian, a savior, a true symbol of loyalty. Television crews arrived, eager to capture the sight of the shepherd who had dug through the night to uncover what no human had dared imagine. But Rocky did not care for cameras or headlines. His world was simple: the little girl's hand in his reach, the faint sound of her breath, and the knowledge that she was safe. The town honored him in their own way. Children drew pictures of him, families brought him treats, and the mayor declared a day in his name. But the truest reward was the bond that grew between Rocky and the girl. Each time she smiled at him, weak though she was, his tail wagged gently. Each time she whispered softly into his ear, though no one else could hear the words, his eyes closed in contentment. Rocky had not just saved her life. He had given the entire town a reminder of what loyalty, love, and instinct can uncover. He had turned a forgotten lot into a place of miracles, and a night of despair into a story that would be told for generations. And as he lay by the hospital bed, his breathing steady and calm, one truth became clear to all who saw. Sometimes the bravest heroes walk on four legs, guided not by reason, but by a heart that refuses to give up. The days that followed felt like a slow exhale for the little town. What had begun as a night of chaos and disbelief soon transformed into a season of healing, gratitude, and reflection. People who had once passed by the empty lot without a second glance now stopped in silence, staring at the torn-up earth where Rocky had dug like mad. The ground was scarred, mud-hardened by the storm and the rescuer's shovels, but it no longer seemed like just another forgotten corner of town. It had become a place where life had clawed its way back from the darkness, a sacred ground that told a story everyone swore they would never forget. Neighbors who had mocked the dog's restless behavior now shook their heads in awe whenever they remembered his howls. They whispered to one another on porches and in grocery lines, admitting quietly that they would never again ignore an animal's instincts. "Dogs see what we can't," one old man muttered as he sipped his morning coffee. "They feel it deep inside. We should have listened sooner." His words were repeated again and again, turning into a lesson that spread through every household. Parents reminded their children to pay attention to the whispers of nature, to the warnings carried not in human words but in the cries of animals who still carried the old wisdom of survival. The little girl's recovery became the center of the town's hopes. Though fragile at first, she slowly gained strength under the careful eyes of doctors and the constant presence of Rocky. She laughed faintly for the first time weeks later, her voice soft but filled with a music that made nurses weep. The puppy, now stronger and playful, bounced across her hospital bed, its paws tapping against the sheets as if celebrating life itself. Each time she giggled at its clumsy leaps, Rocky's tail wagged steadily, his eyes bright with contentment. It was clear to everyone that the bond between the child and the shepherd was something beyond explanation. She reached for him instinctively, even in sleep, and he lowered his head gently to her side, as though promising that nothing in the world could harm her again. It was a picture of trust so pure, so unshakable, that even hardened officers who had spent their careers staring down danger found themselves wiping tears from their eyes. One deputy confessed quietly, "I thought I had seen it all in this job. But this dog showed us what loyalty really looks like." When the girl was finally well enough to leave the hospital, The entire town gathered to welcome her home. The streets filled with neighbors carrying lanterns, their soft glow lighting the evening like a parade of hope. Children waved small flags, shopkeepers closed their doors early, and elders stood side by side, their hands clasped in reverence. The little girl, carried in her mother's arms, wore a smile brighter than any lantern. Rocky walked proudly beside them, the puppy prancing at his heels. The cheers that rose in that moment carried far beyond the town's borders, as if the world itself was listening. The mayor gave a speech that night, standing on the steps of the town hall with his voice cracking. He spoke of miracles, of loyalty, and of innocence. "This town has seen many things," he said, "but nothing has ever shaken us like this. A child and a puppy, buried in silence, brought back into the light, not by our wisdom, but by the instincts of a dog who refused to be ignored. Tonight we honor Rocky, but more than that, we honor the truth he reminded us of. Sometimes the purest hearts know more than reason ever can." The crowd erupted in applause, many with tears streaming freely down their cheeks. From that day forward, the once-forgotten empty lot was no longer dismissed. The townsfolk came together and transformed it into a small garden of remembrance. Flowers were planted along the edges, benches were placed beneath newly planted trees, and at its center stood a stone marker with simple words carved deep. Here, life was saved by loyalty. Children played there in the afternoons, families brought picnics, and visitors paused in quiet reflection. The place that had once been ordinary and overlooked was now filled with meaning, a symbol of survival and a reminder of what they had almost lost. As the seasons changed, Rocky remained by the girl's side. He was no longer just a pet, he was her guardian, her constant companion, her silent protector. They walked the streets together, her small hand resting on his fur, her laughter trailing behind them like sunlight. The puppy, too, followed, bouncing with youthful energy, completing the picture of joy. Wherever they went, people smiled, nodding to themselves, reminded of the night they all bore witness to a miracle. The narrator's voice, echoing softly in memory, lingered in the hearts of the townsfolk. Loyalty is not taught, it is given. Innocence is not broken, it is tested. And miracles are not always seen in thunder or fire, but in the quiet persistence of a dog's digging paws and a child's fragile breath. The little girl grew stronger each day, her bond with Rocky deepening into something unshakable. She would sit beside him in the garden of remembrance, her blue dress fluttering in the wind, her small voice whispering secrets only he seemed to understand. His ears perked, his eyes softened, and his tail wagged gently as though assuring her he would keep every word safe. For the town, the lesson became a part of their identity. They told the story to their children, their grandchildren, reminding each new generation of the night Rocky saved them all from silence and despair. And as they spoke, their voices always lowered with reverence at the end. Sometimes the truest instincts uncover truths that reason cannot. And sometimes, the greatest heroes walk on four legs. As the story draws to a close, one truth lingers in every heart that heard it. This was not just a rescue. It was a reminder that loyalty and love can shine even in the darkest places, when hope feels buried and silence seems endless. What Rocky did that night will forever be remembered, not only because he uncovered a child and a puppy, but because he showed an entire town that faith, instinct, and love can change everything. We often think miracles must come in grand, unexplainable forms. But here, in this quiet town, the miracle arrived through a dog's relentless digging and his refusal to give up when everyone else doubted. His paws tore into the soil, his voice howled through the night, and his heart never wavered. And because of that, lives were saved. Think about it. How many times do we ignore the signals around us? How many times do we overlook what we cannot explain? Dogs, with their pure hearts and keen instincts, remind us to listen, to see beyond what is obvious. Rocky sensed what humans could not, and in doing so, he carried a truth greater than reason. So I ask you directly, do you believe animals can sense what humans cannot? Do you believe their instincts are sometimes closer to truth than all our knowledge combined? If tonight's story moved you, perhaps it is because, deep down, you already know the answer. Loyalty, love, and innocence carry wisdom that no words can fully capture. The town will never forget Rocky's heroism. The girl, now stronger, walks hand in hand with her guardian every day. The puppy, playful and alive, reminds everyone of the second chance that was given. And the once-forgotten lot stands as a symbol of survival, a place where life broke free because one dog refused to be silent. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in kindness. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that hope can rise even from the darkest ground. Because stories like these are not just about the past. They are reminders for us all that no act of loyalty, no cry of love is ever in vain. And when you look into the eyes of a dog, perhaps you'll remember Rocky. You'll remember the child who lived. And you'll know that sometimes the smallest voices and the purest hearts uncover truths that reason cannot.